All right, so buckle up because we're diving deep into some pretty intense history here.
Oh,
The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in 1990, we've got a whole stack of sources like declassified intel reports, personal accounts, even environmental reports, and some of this stuff. Well, let's just say it'll make your jaw drop. This isn't just some dry military history, though. This is about high stakes gambles, global power plays, and those ripple effects, the kind that are still shaping the Middle East today, even all these years later.
yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. I think to really understand this whole thing, we got to kind of rewind a bit back to the late 1980s. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein at the time, they'd just come out of that brutal war with Iran, and their economy, well, it was in shambles, to put it mildly. Yeah. They were drowning in debt, and they started looking to their neighbors, especially Kuwait, for, some financial lifeline.
Okay, so I gotta ask, right? Why would Kuwait, I mean, any country really, lend money to a country that just, finished a massive war? It just seems, I don't know, kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, right. Well, during that Iran-Iraq war, the Gulf states, and that includes Kuwait, they saw Iraq as kind of like a buffer zone, a buffer against Iran and the potential spread of their revolution. So they poured money into Iraq's war effort, hoping to, keep Iran's influence in check.
Mm.
But then, once the fighting stopped and the dust settled, those loans, well, they became a huge point of contention.
So enter Saddam Hussein, a guy who, let's face it, never backed down from a fight. And he starts pointing fingers, right? Accusing Kuwait of all things, flooding the oil market, driving down prices, and basically sabotaging Iraq's efforts to rebuild.
Yeah, and that's where things get really, really fascinating. See, while it's true that Kuwait was producing more oil than OPEC quotas allowed, Saddam's accusations, well, they went way beyond just simple economics. This guy was a master of propaganda, and he twisted this whole thing, this narrative of Kuwait deliberately trying to undermine Iraq. He used it to whip up public anger and, well, to justify his own aggressive ambitions.
And just to make things even more complicated, you've got the whole slant drilling accusation thrown into the mix. Basically, Saddam's claiming that Kuwait is stealing oil straight from Iraq's Rumaila field by drilling sideways under the border.
Now, slant drilling, it is technically possible, but it's incredibly difficult to actually prove.
Hey.
And Saddam knew that. He used this accusation like another tool, another way to demonize Kuwait, to make himself look like the victim in all of this.
And then, just to add another layer, he pulls out the historical card, claiming Kuwait was, get this, historically part of Iraq, conveniently forgetting, of course, that international borders had been established decades earlier.
Oh, absolutely. He was really laying it on thick.
So you've got this potent mix brewing: economic desperation, political maneuvering, and a healthy dose of historical revisionism all swirling together. It's like Saddam was setting the stage for some major power play.
Exactly. It was a calculated risk, no doubt. He saw a chance to grab control of Kuwait's massive oil wealth, thinking it could boost Iraq's standing in the region, and of course, solidify his own grip on power. But he also knew, he had to know, that this gamble, it could backfire spectacularly. And oh boy, did it ever. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, Saddam goes all in, launches a full-scale invasion of Kuwait. Over 100,000 Iraqi troops with a terrifying amount of firepower. They storm across the border. It was brutal, swift, and it sent shockwaves. The whole world was watching. Yeah, the speed and the sheer force of that invasion, it completely blindsided Kuwait. Their defenses, they were just overrun in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
And by August 4th, Saddam's declaring Kuwait as, get this, Iraq's 19th province. It was a bold move, no doubt about it. But it also set off this chain reaction, a chain reaction that would completely reshape, the entire geopolitical landscape, really.
Okay, so Saddam's taken a huge gamble, and at least for now, it's paid off. He's got Kuwait, he's got their oil, but he's also got the whole world staring him down. So, what happens next? What's the global reaction to this power grab?
Well, the international community, they weren't just going to sit back and watch. The UN Security Council, they condemned the invasion right away, demanded Iraq pull back their troops, and they hit him hard with economic sanctions, hoping to basically cripple Iraq's economy and force Saddam to back down.
So sanctions, those are like the international equivalent of a timeout, right? You're trying to change behavior without, resorting to anything more, drastic.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. The idea is you put the squeeze on a country economically to make them, fall in line with international rules. But the thing is, sanctions, they don't always work the way you'd hope. They can take a long time to have any real effect. And a lot of times, it's the everyday people, not the leaders, who end up suffering the most.
And in this case, there was a real worry that sanctions alone just wouldn't be enough to dislodge Saddam. He wasn't exactly known for being, reasonable. And there were concerns he might just dig in even deeper, putting the Kuwaiti people at even greater risk.
Right. And you also have to remember the oil factor. This invasion has sent shockwaves through the global energy markets. I mean, if Saddam decided to set his sights on Saudi Arabia next, which a lot of people thought he might, well, the consequences could have been absolutely catastrophic. We're talking a potential global energy crisis, and the ripple effects, well, it's hard to even imagine.
So the world knew it had to act, and act decisively. Enter Operation Desert Shield. The U.S., under President George H.W. Bush, takes the lead and assembles this massive coalition. Over 30 countries, hundreds of thousands of troops deployed to the region. It was a show of force, really, unlike anything the world had seen in, well, decades, I'd say.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about, flexing muscles. There was a genuine belief that a strong military presence was crucial, both to deter Saddam from any further aggression and to be ready, just in case, if things escalated.
So all this is happening, and meanwhile, behind the scenes, you've got all these intense diplomatic efforts going on, right? Was there any realistic chance of a peaceful resolution at this point?
There were definitely attempts at negotiation, for sure. Nobody wanted to rush into another war, especially in such a volatile region. But Saddam, well, he seemed to be almost emboldened by his early success. He just refused to budge, clung to this delusion that he could actually hold on to Kuwait, withstand the pressure from, well, the entire world, really.
So the world's watching, hoping for some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, but ultimately it just wasn't in the cards. January 17th, 1991, the U.S.-led coalition launches Operation Desert Storm, and suddenly the skies above Baghdad are lit up with the first wave of attacks. It was the start of what would become a 6-week air campaign.
Yeah, and that initial phase of the war, it was almost like a technological spectacle. You had precision-guided bombs, missiles raining down on Iraqi military targets, their command centers, supply lines. It was a real display of American military might.
I remember watching the news coverage at the time. It was almost surreal, those night vision images of bombs hitting their targets with pinpoint accuracy.
Yeah.
It was so different from, the grainy footage you'd see from older wars.
Right, but it wasn't just about the flashy tech. The air campaign, it was incredibly effective in crippling Iraq's ability to fight back. They inflicted heavy losses, disrupted communications, really degraded their air force. It was a crucial step in setting the stage for a ground invasion.
And the fact that coalition forces suffered relatively few casualties during this air campaign, well, it contributed to this idea, this narrative of a clean war. A narrative that, as we'll see, would be challenged later on as the true human cost of the conflict became more apparent.
Exactly. It was a somewhat sanitized view of war, at least initially. But war is never truly clean, and the real cost, the human suffering, well, it often takes time to fully reveal itself.
So after weeks of relentless bombing, the ground invasion finally begins in February 1991. And it's over incredibly fast. Coalition forces with overwhelming air power backing them up, they just sweep through Iraqi defenses. Kuwait is liberated in just 100 hours. A decisive victory, no doubt. But the war's story, it's not over yet, not by a long shot. Some of the most troubling chapters were still being written. Last we left off, the coalition had just pulled off this incredible ground victory. Kuwait was free. But as we dug deeper into the sources, it became clear that this war, well, it wasn't exactly a clean break. There was this long shadow in terms of both human and environmental costs.
Yeah, no doubt about it. While the world was celebrating Kuwait's liberation, Saddam Hussein, well, he wasn't about to go down quietly, not without leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. As Iraqi forces retreated, they went scorched earth, literally setting fire to hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells.
It's almost impossible to comprehend the sheer scale of that environmental catastrophe. I mean, we've all seen the pictures, but can you help our listeners really grasp what this looked like, what the impact was on the ground?
Just imagine driving through this landscape where the horizon, it's not mountains or buildings, but just these towering columns of fire and smoke. Over 600 oil wells, each one spearing flames hundreds of feet high, turning day into night with this thick black smoke. The air, it was heavy with soot. The heat was intense, and the stench of burning oil, it was just suffocating. It was a scene of utter devastation, like something out of, Dante's Inferno.
And it wasn't just, a horrifying spectacle. The environmental consequences, they were staggering. We're talking millions of barrels of oil burning every single day, releasing this toxic cocktail of chemicals into the air, the soil, everything.
The immediate impact, well, it was just horrific. Respiratory problems, skin irritation, and this constant fear of long-term health effects. And then you have the long-term damage to the ecosystem. Oil seeping into the groundwater, contaminating the soil, creating these vast toxic lakes. It was an absolute nightmare scenario for Kuwait, and this stark reminder of the devastating environmental cost of war.
And as if the burning oil fields weren't bad enough, Saddam also unleashed another environmental weapon, a massive oil spill in the Persian Gulf.
Oh yeah, that's right. As they retreated, Iraqi forces deliberately pumped millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf, created one of the largest oil spills in history. Those images of oil-soaked birds, dying marine life, they were just heartbreaking. It was a deliberate act, an act of environmental terrorism aimed at crippling Kuwait's economy and punishing the world for, well, for opposing him.
So the war ends, Kuwait is free, but they're left with this monumental task of rebuilding their nation, their environment, everything. What about Iraq, the country that took this huge gamble and lost so much? What were the lasting consequences for them?
Well, Iraq faced international isolation, and then there were the UN sanctions, which were crippling.
Mm.
The idea was to pressure Saddam Hussein into complying with international law, but those sanctions, they had a devastating impact on the Iraqi people. Food shortages, lack of medicine, economic collapse. It was a recipe for widespread suffering, and it fueled resentment against Saddam's regime.
It's almost, well, it's a tragic irony, isn't it? A war launched in the name of economic gain ends up leading to economic ruin, not just for the aggressor, but for innocent civilians caught in the middle.
Yeah, it's the tragic reality of war. It's often justified with these grand narratives, national interest, liberation, but it's always the ordinary people who pay the price. And that price, it can linger for generations.
And speaking of prices, the Gulf War also solidified America's position as, well, the dominant military power in the world. But this victory, it came with its own set of complexities, its own long-term consequences.
Absolutely. The Gulf War, it marked the beginning of a long U.S. military presence in the Middle East, a presence that would have huge implications for the region, for U.S. foreign policy, even today. It also raised all these questions about the limits of military intervention, the role of international organizations, the balance of power in a region that's, well, it's always been a tinderbox.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a sense of, well, just how complex this whole thing was. There were clear aggressors, clear victims, but also this tangled web of interconnected factors, unintended consequences, and these scars that are still visible today.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, it's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even when you have a decisive military victory, the consequences, they can be far-reaching, unpredictable. It's a story that really underscores the importance of diplomacy, the need for global cooperation, and the urgent need to find peaceful solutions to these international conflicts.
And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked some new thoughts, some new questions. Maybe you're thinking about the long-term environmental impact of those oil fires, that oil spill, or maybe you're reflecting on the human cost of war, the challenges of peace building. Whatever questions this has raised for you, we encourage you to keep digging, keep learning, and keep connecting those dots of history. It's the best way to understand the world we live in today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.